Before we get started, we want to get a sense for who's in the room with us before we introduce ourselves. How many architects do we have in the room? All right. How many school districts do we have? Okay, so 2. Where are you guys from? Oh, cool. Cool. Any engineers? Okay. And any contractors, general contractors? Cool. All right, so we're going to talk about a study that we worked on with Perkins Eastman here, measuring some indoor environmental metrics in the DC school system. But before we get started, we want to recognize J&J Flooring, who actually helped make this possible. So Russ is here in the back. So thank you, Russ. They provided great support for the study, and we wouldn't be here without them. So we want to make sure we recognize them. So I'm Patrick Davis. I'm the Deputy Chief of Facilities for the DC Public School System.
I'm Katie Herber from Perkins Eastman. I'm a sustainability specialist.
I'm Sean O'Donnell, also with Perkins Eastman, and I lead our school design practice. Cool. So with that, our learning objectives, I think, are pretty simple. What we're hoping to do is sort of inspire a conversation about how design impacts educational outcomes, and in many ways that's the theme of this entire exploration. But what we're also hoping to do is give you some of the things that we've learned and some of the tools, so that you can take this back to your projects and the work that you're doing, so that we can all continue to make that connection to the outcomes that we hope are the result of our architectural projects, but also certainly conform to the mission and vision of our clients. So with that, this conversation, from my point of view as a practice area leader for school design practice, is that this isn't one-off. This is actually inspiring a new way that we're working, a new iterative process and a feedback loop on the work that we're doing, so that the work continues to get better and better and achieve that sort of mission of getting to enhancing education and making that really strong linkage to architectural outcomes to education. So with that, as we continue to work and practice, what we reflect on is that a lot of money is being spent on every year, and now this number is getting a little old, but I think it's still consistent with the past few years. So $90 billion spent on educational facilities, in any one year is a lot of money, and this is pre-K through 12 and higher ed, combined together. But what we've also realized with Patrick's assistance is...
Yeah, so these are just sort of the construction dollars that are spent, but as school districts know, we have an operating expense that goes out every year. So one of the things that we love about these modernization and construction programs is, and actually the point of this conference is, how do we make our buildings more sustainable so we can actually lower those operating costs? From the DC standpoint, it's actually almost easier for us to get debt or some bond money to pay for the construction, but the ongoing operating cost is something that I'm personally really concerned about, because it's a big thing. It's actually outside of our staffing. Our fixed costs, utility payments, are our highest ticket item that we pay in our budget. So, working with Sean and his team to figure out how to get these buildings to be as efficient as possible just allows us to invest more money into schools rather than paying utility bills.
So to give you an illustration, and one of the sort of formative projects, in the work that we're showing you today, this is Dunbar Senior High School in Washington, D.C. And you can see that almost by accident, it became the highest scoring Lead for Schools project in the world. And really it became that because we were trying to push this idea of high performance design, with the belief that architecture certainly has an impact on education, but also to get to some of the issues that Patrick was talking about, and making sure that the building is operating efficiently, and that again the feedback is into education and not so much into the operational costs of the facility. And after we opened the building, though, some other data started to come in. So while the LEED score is great, and we love that, it wasn't the goal in any way, shape, or form. Actually, the goals of the project were very much more like the bottom line here. So a number of different metrics started to reveal themselves in the operation of the building. So they reported the highest test score gains of any high school in the city after moving back and occupying the building. They also increased their enrollment. They're also graduating more students. So our question in many ways was, of course, we think architecture is entirely responsible for all those changes, but then it was really an exploration of, that was a joke, sorry, that's really terrible. It's early, so the question for us is, how do we connect the top and bottom lines here? So we were not alone, I think, in this sort of question, though, is are these things truly connected, and can we demonstrate that? And one Sunday morning, while making coffee, I was listening to Freakonomics, and it happened to be on this group called the Behavioral Insights Group that Britain established, because exactly that, they realized that we're spending tons of money, Dunbar alone is a $100 million building, on infrastructure and other things, but we truly don't really know what the impact is of those investments. So what's the return on investment in sort of financial terms, with respect to the impact on education? So what we've been doing is trying to figure that out, and through a series of sort of action research projects, leveraging each of our projects, starting with Dunbar and one project prior to that. But what we've been trying to explore is this idea of what is the impact? That's the question, and who are we impacting in many ways? So students, faculty, the community, our schools have the potential to have tremendous value and return on investment. But again, we don't know exactly what that return is. And about the same time, a lot of investment has been put into the pursuit of net zero energy in schools, which we think is a terrific ambition, again, going back to the operational cost there. But what we've been positing, though, is that it's a little closer to our client's mission, like Patrick, is that if we can use the rigor of a net zero energy process, again, I'm sure everybody knows at the end of the year you can assess whether or not you've achieved your goals, generally in a net zero energy project. So the question is, can we actually use the same kind of rigor to demonstrate that our buildings are having the same kind of returns on the educational side? So we coined this term, sort of a play on it, as net positive education. And a lot of this, the rest of the balance of this conversation from my standpoint is about that. How do we get to that level of rigor, in making that connection between architecture and education? So we've been, again, using the number of our projects as sort of action research projects. We had, even prior to Dunbar, which you see as number 2 here, started a post-occupancy evaluation process. But in many ways, through this iterative process, from Dunbar to MLK, which is 3, and to the study that we'll share with you later in a few moments, is this process of refining and the research interventions and how we do this, and also trying to get truly to those outcomes. So just to share with you, in many ways, the sort of foundational research project that is the basis of the second study that we'll share with you today is a school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which we were asked again to pursue net zero energy. And in many ways, some folks were skeptical about that, particularly from the school side, suggesting that maybe that's a goal that's in tension, with respect to allocating funds relative to the educational outcomes, that certainly the district was thinking about. So almost the perfect project for us to try and make those connections together. And just a little bit on this project. Again, it's in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it's actually 3 schools on one very tiny site. So there's a preschool, there's a an elementary school and a middle school. They call them lower and upper schools. But it's also a community school in every sense of the word, so it operates throughout the day from 6 a.m. into late into the night at 11 p.m. So a very, very actively used community resource. So again, I'm starting to demonstrate again the power of the place, but again, also giving us the opportunity to explore all these disparate issues. It also allowed us, because it was a new building, to explore the performance of the existing buildings that these schools had occupied prior to moving into the new building. Not going to go into great detail, but because, again, we had an elementary school, a middle school, they were in different buildings before they consolidated onto the new campus. So you can see what the architecture of the one's from the 70s, one's from the 30s, so different in several different manners, but we'll talk a little bit about their performance. But again, the new building had many goals, but one of them, of course, is this idea of high-performance school design. And the greatest demonstration of that, I think, is the photo on the right, in many ways, where the environment is radically different than you saw in those older buildings, perhaps, and some of the best day-lit classrooms that we've done to date. But the other factor here as well, again, is this idea of community. So, certainly the school is drawing the community in, with their children, but it also is used after hours by the community, but also recognizing that community has another factor, that we're trying to foster a professional work environment for the teachers here as well. And in many ways, interestingly, this is the first time I think some folks recognize that energy, and you see all the plug load pieces there, and education came together, because that's the faculty workroom, so we could get all the coffee pots and everything out of the classrooms, centralize them in the faculty workroom. That would draw faculty together serendipitously, and so I think people started to see that, hey, these ideas actually are sympathetic and, if not, resonating with one another. And so what we posited was that the superintendent, the school side's point of view was, let's create an innovative, forward-thinking, 21st century learning environment. The mayor was the one pushing the net zero energy side. So we could put those together and create that equation, just like Dunbar did, high-performance, sustainable learning environment. And our hypothesis then became, as we started to leverage it, the project as a research opportunity, was that, of course, high performance improves occupant satisfaction and performance. Also, that high performance design enhances the sense of community among the students and the staff, but also has other impacts on the other scales of community as well. So we started to put together, a new version of our pre- and post-occupancy evaluation process, partly because, we had enhanced our team. Katie had joined us, and some of her colleagues at that point, giving us, a greater set of expertise, particularly from the sort of sustainable design side, so we could start to build a process that was both qualitative and quantitative. But we realized that there's a lot to focus on, and so we had to narrow the scope. And so we started to focus and drill down on this idea of indoor environmental quality, but then also, which has a number of facets that we could explore. These were the ones that we defined for this particular study, so everything from daylighting to acoustics. But we could also explore that sense of community here as well at a number of different scales, because we could study the individual school's sense of community, we could study how each school cohabitates on the site, and then we could also talk about how the school impacts the community at large. And with that, we started to build a process which I think this is the first time that we did this, is the pre-occupancy part. Post-occupancy has been talked about since the 60s, but the important piece is that you need a benchmark, to really see if you've moved the lever right in design. So we studied those prior facilities and how people were engaging with those facilities, and then the new building as well. But of course, we did a literature review, the two primary inputs for us from the users and the built environment were an occupant survey, which was using SurveyMonkey, so it was online. But we've tried to tailor that, as we'll talk about in a moment, to different people that might be responding to that, and their age, their development, their access to technology. But the other is that we could get into the environment and start measuring things. So from the IEQ metrics here, and you can see one of our colleagues here actually using some of the tools that we'll talk about in a moment. But the third leg of the stool was this idea of what educational indicators do we need to try and tap into to make this connection. And in many ways, this was the part of this process that we didn't quite get completely done. But, of course, there's a lot of inputs from the literature review. Many of you probably know these studies, but if you don't, you should check at least these ones out as an input. Certainly the Chan School is doing incredible work on cognition and CO2, and a clever classroom environment, and from the University of Salford is sort of all encompassing on this kind of impacts. And then everybody probably knows the daylight studies that came out of Heshawn Mahoney. So here's what we found in this first process. One, that people were really happy with the daylight in the building. That compares very positively to the older buildings, so old MLK, old Powse, Putnam Avenue School, as you can see the demonstrated change in people's perception of daylighting in the buildings. Likewise, the buildings performing within the thermal comfort ranges, so again, thinking about how people perceive that. And of course, one of the major inputs is, acoustics in the environment. So again, another significant return and improvement, from the prior facilities here. We'll talk more about acoustics in a moment as we continue to learn about the importance of this in the environment. But air quality and the general outcomes as to the feedback that we received, that, not quite universally, and my client said, I don't understand why this isn't all 100%. There's a serious case of building envy, about this building, across the district at this point, and everybody wants to teach in it. I think the lesson there is that, probably not everybody's happy all the time, but I think it's seen as sort of a resounding positive impact, and relationship between people's perception of the environment and the design and the inputs. But with that, we continue to push this process forward, and Patrick will tell us how we've been able to do that.
So before we dig into the DC study, I want to give a quick snapshot of what the DC school system looks like and the modernization program that we have undertaken. I think when people hear DC today, you think about Fox News and CNN, but there's a lot of people that actually live in DC, and there's a lot of really beautiful kids that go to school in DC. So we have over 100 schools. We have 110 schools in the district, public schools. There's about the same number of charter schools that fall under a different organizational structure, but what I oversee, there's 110 schools. Our vision is pretty simple. We want to make sure that all the kids, every single kid in the district, feels loved and challenged and ready to move on. And my job from the facility standpoint is to make sure that the building doesn't get in the way of that. It needs to enhance their learning environment. And we work with folks like Sean to make sure that happens. But, DC, it's a very, we're financially in a good spot. But as you can see in the chart here, the students that we serve, actually almost 3/4 of them come from economically disadvantaged households. So we really see the entire gamut of all the students and families within DC. So I always like to throw this slide up here. We talk a lot about numbers. You're going to hear a lot of numbers this entire week. But, this is why we do the work. It's, these smiling faces and the kids. And, how do we make sure we're we're getting this kid to smile every day in the classroom. If you walk into a classroom and it's 45 degrees in there or 100 degrees in there, 90 degrees in there, you're not going to see a smiling face like that. So it's always a good reminder for me to sort of pull back a little bit. We're going to talk about the numbers here, but this is why we all do the work. And if I could sort of get one thing out of you when we leave here this entire week, think about these faces when you think about DC. Don't think about the politics. So in DC, we are extremely lucky. I've had the experience of working in other school districts, and I know how lucky we are. We've spent over $4 billion since the early 2000s on school construction. We spend about $400 million a year, which typically equates to 4 to 5 new schools opening every year. And that takes a lot of people to buy into it. That takes the city, the residents, the council, the executive branch. And since the early 2000s, everyone has sort of come together and realized how important this is. And we're extremely lucky to be able to build beautiful buildings like you see on the bottom here. Before I started, DC was like most school districts. Kids would walk into the building with their jackets on during the winter because the systems weren't working properly. But because of this, we've been able to touch just about every school. By 2025, every single school in the portfolio will receive a major capital investment, which is something I'm very proud of. So I think, when we raised hands, most of the folks were architects in this room. And if you work on a school project, you sort of know this process, but for folks who don't, from the client side, we're the ones that develop the program when we're talking about a school construction project. So we outline the number of kids that go into the building, the types of spaces that need to be in there. It's essentially the roadmap we give to the architects to design. That document's called an ed spec. So we recently updated that ed spec a few years ago to make sure we're capturing all of the 21st century design standards and make sure our kids have the spaces that they need to learn. We don't learn in an environment like this anymore, honestly. We don't sit with a teacher in front of the classroom. It's a lot more collaborative. It's a lot more flexible. So that was one of the big things that we worked into this updated ed spec document is we still have our core spaces, but we need to make sure we factor in as much flexibility and adaptability as possible. And then we work with great folks like Sean to make that sort of plan come to life in terms of a full building. DC, like most urban jurisdictions, have a wide variety of building stock. So when we undertake these projects, often we're bound by historic constraints. So sometimes we just renovate existing buildings. Often we renovate buildings with an addition. And then rare, but sometimes, like Dunbar, we're able to do 100% new construction. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter to us. The kids that go to the building shouldn't really care if it's a new construction or renovation. We need to make sure that all of these goals are met in the design. And that's the challenge that we give to folks like Sean and the designers to do. So being green build, we want to just sort of highlight some of the sustainability initiatives that we have. So all of our projects are required to be LEED Gold. So DC passed a Healthy Buildings Act a number of years ago, and that outlined that every single building, any new construction project over, I think it's like $10 to $15 million, is required to meet LEED Gold. So this is actually updated. I think we have a newer slide, but just last week we updated we have 28 LEED certified schools, so almost a quarter of our entire population. We've got two LEED Platinum schools, and then we just put an RFP out for our first net zero project. So that'll start design in the coming months. In addition to sort of the design side, the district has entered into a power purchasing agreement with a vendor to install PV panels on our roofs. So we basically provide our roofs as real estate, and this vendor comes in, provides all the work, and we get some of the benefit for the PV power that goes on our roof. We have about 30 buildings that have solar on our roof, and that's growing in addition to the major modernization program. And then on sort of the softer side, the sustainability world goes a lot of different directions. It's really important to us that kids get to put their hands on this stuff. So we have a lot of active gardening programs throughout our portfolio that we actually partner with our food and nutrition team. So when they're growing items in the gardens, we actually work with our food team to make sure that when the seasonal items come up, we actually incorporate that into the menus for the kids so they can actually see the benefit and understand where their food is actually coming from. So sort of looking forward and where we're going to segue into next is we've done all this work, we spent billions and billions of dollars, and we have some beautiful buildings. But quite frankly, we've never taken a second to pause and look back. We always just move on to the next one for a variety of reasons. The work is always the work, and it never stops. But we've never really taken a pause and gone back and evaluate, are we doing the right things in our buildings, or are the kids really benefiting from all this work? You know, you walk around to a new building and you can look at it and see, this building looks nice, but are actually the kids really benefiting from it? So we were really excited when Sean and Katie and J&J Flooring came to us with this potential opportunity to do a study and really evaluate the benefit of our work. It helps us from a number of standpoints. It helps me talk to the mayor and say, hey, all this money you're investing, it's actually doing something. We can actually point to data. We've always sort of known anecdotally that this program has been good, but to actually have data is actually really important for me to be able to say, hey, give us more money so we can do this better, bigger, better, faster, and more. We compete with the transportation folks for funding. We compete with Parks and Rec. So if we can actually prove that the money is going to a good cause, it really helps us make that case for why it's important work. And then just quite frankly, I hate doing something because that's how we've done it in the past. I think one of the things we're going to show in this study is that we're not doing enough in a certain area and that we need to make changes. And that's really what I'm really most optimistic about from this study. There's a lot of great sort of selling points that you're going to see, but there's things that we can learn from, and it's really important for us to make sure that every project moving forward improves. And I think having the data to do that is just the important way to do it. So what did we do? So we partnered with Sean and the folks to come up with a study. Similar to their Cambridge study, we looked at thermal comfort, acoustics, daylighting, and air quality in our classrooms. So we looked at a few different ways. We looked at different schools. So we looked at 5 schools that have recently undergone a modernization, have opened in the past few years with the latest design standards that we outlined earlier. And then we actually also looked at 4 schools that haven't gone through the modernization yet, so we can sort of compare what does a non-modernized school look like compared to a modernized school. I will say all these non-modernized schools are actually up for design right now, so we actually, selfishly, we picked these schools so we have a baseline data. We can go back to these schools when they open in a few years. So Katie will talk through the study and what they ended up doing, but as part of the project, surveys were given to staff and teachers at all grades, and we'll show you examples of what those look like. We were strategic about which schools were picked. We wanted to make sure there was a good geographic and socioeconomic diversity in terms of what we picked. And I'm going to segue to Katie, who's going to go into more details about the methodology.
Thank you, Patrick. All right, so to talk a little bit more in detail about the methodology we actually used to study these schools, we really wanted to get the broadest picture possible and really expand upon that Cambridge study that Sean introduced. So we looked at 3 main types of data. The first are those occupant surveys, so we looked at both students and staffs in all of the schools that we were looking at. The next was the on-site measurement portion, looking at those IEQ factors within the classrooms themselves. And then, since we were working closely with the district, we also had the opportunity to get a lot of archival data, both from the district itself and what's publicly available already, which are already the metrics that DC Public Schools is using to measure success within the schools. So to talk about each of those pieces in a little bit more detail, first the surveys. The really interesting part of this process was the schools we were looking at were elementary and middle schools, so we needed to adjust our survey templates a little bit to work for those populations. So for our middle school students and our older elementary students, we used some pictures in our questions to be able to really make sure they were understanding what was being asked of them. The teachers had not a much longer survey, but a significantly longer survey that looked at some more factors around their school and asked some more in-depth questions. So we got a little bit more information from that population. And then my very favorite population was our kindergarten to 2nd grade students. We wanted to include them as well and get their opinions. So we created a 1-page worksheet that the students could fill out where they could pick one IEQ factor, tell us if it made them happy, unhappy, ready to learn, not ready to learn, healthy or unhealthy, and tell us why in 1 sentence, and then draw us a lovely picture of what they thought of their classroom and their IEQ factors. So these were my favorite results to process by far. Next, we went into the on-site measurement portion. So we have a variety of tools at our disposal that we use to measure these IEQ factors, and I'll introduce a couple of them a little bit later for an activity we're going to do. But you can see us here using them on-site. We did this study over about a 5-week period last winter. So we went to 2 or 3 schools a week with a team of volunteers who were taking the measurements on-site. And then we did the daylight measurements over spring break so that we could be in the classrooms but not disruptive of the learning that was occurring. So the measurements that we actually took came into the 4 categories of IEQ. First being daylight. We looked at both distribution throughout the space, what areas were overlit, what areas were underlit, and which areas were appropriately lit. And then also looked at glare within the space as well. Moving on to thermal comfort, we looked at the air temperature and humidity. We did this over a period of a week so that we could observe both occupied and unoccupied conditions as well. And then we also did thermal imaging of the exterior of the building so that we could see where we were having issues with thermal bridging and heat loss on the envelope. Then moving on to acoustics, we looked at ambient noise within the space as well. We did this both again in the occupied and unoccupied conditions so that we could see what the background baseline level was just from the mechanical systems or noise from the street that was coming into the facility, and also when there were students in the classroom and they were doing activities, how loud it got during those conditions as well. And then finally, in air quality, we looked at both CO2 concentrations within the space to see how those would build up throughout the day and how the mechanical demand was keeping up with that, and then also VOCs within the space as well. And then for archival data, using the metrics we were able to get from DCPS and other publicly available sources, we looked at student attendance rates within the school, boundary rates, which is actually a metric fairly specific to DC, so students are able to attend any DC public school they'd like to, but they do have a neighborhood school that's assigned to them, which is the closest school to their house. So this metric is looking at the number of students who choose that neighborhood school as the school that they actually attend. So that was contrasted also with enrollment rates, just looking at how many students are attending that school. Also student nurse visits throughout the year, faculty retention, and crime incidents in the block surrounding the school. But really what we were interested in doing was looking at how all of these pieces of data came together. So we actually brought a statistician onto our team to help us look at all of this data and try to identify the connections and what was causing these different issues. So we're going to get into the results of that study, but we're going to keep you in suspense for a little bit longer. We'll get to that a little later. But for right now, we're going to move into a quick activity and demonstrate this whole process right here in this room. So we're going to use you guys as our guinea pigs of a POE of this room.
All right, so the first one we're going to do, if everyone can take out their cell phone, you can actually use your cell phone. So we have let's see, is it, okay. So what we're going to ask you to do is, how have you found the acoustics to be in this room? So what you're going to do is you're going to text one of these codes, for which one you identify with, to the number 22333. We'll be able to see. We hope. Well, that's good. Yeah. Interesting. For folks who are dissatisfied, can you raise your hand? I want to see where you were in the room. But in general, it seems like, the acoustics seem pretty good in here, and they seem good up here. So the next one we want you to think about is air ventilation. How do you feel in the room? Do you feel there's enough circulation of air? So again, text the codes on the left on the chart here to the same number. Not quite as good as the acoustics.
No one's ever extremely dissatisfied.
Yeah, right. Or extremely satisfied here.
Not an extreme group.
Yeah. Very neutral. All right. So the next one you want to think about is temperature. It's obviously cold outside, and I was telling Sean and Katie, I hate winter conferences. You got to lug around your winter jacket around too, but I would agree with the dissatisfied. These lights are intense. interesting. Definitely more of a distribution here. So this is just an example of what we put the students and the staff through. Obviously, a lot more detailed questions than what we're doing here, but it's just this is an example of how everyone's a little different, especially in this temperature one, and everyone's got different body temperatures and what feels good. So interesting results.
All right. So we'll move on to our IEQ metric actual on-site measurements. I have been collecting measurements the whole time. You guys had no idea. So this is my sound meter. It's been sitting up here up front the whole time. So we will actually get a reading of how the acoustics are doing within this space. We always have to explain this one when we take it to schools or offices. It's not actually recording what you're saying. It's just recording how loud you're saying it. So it will log data over time. I have it set right now to take a data point every 45 seconds. So I'm going to get my lovely colleagues to download this data real fast, and at the very end, we'll be able to see how the acoustics actually performed in this space. And then my other tool that we've been using is a Hobo CO2 monitor. So it's collecting temperature, humidity, and CO2 concentrations and has been logging every 5 minutes while we've been in this room as well. So we'll download this data real fast, and we will see how this room is actually performing and be able to compare that with your guys' satisfaction. And then our last piece, Sean.
So the final piece, and I think the most fun piece, of course, is the drawing exercise. Well, okay. So you saw the example that the children did before. What I'd like for you to do, and as many of you are architects, hopefully you'll be interested in drawing for us. But those that are interested, raise your hand, and what I'd like to do is just take 2 minutes and do a sketch on one of these indoor environmental quality factors, so acoustics, thermal comfort, daylight, whatever you like, and just do a quick sketch, stick it on the wall if you like. We can actually make a gallery here amongst the fronds, and again, we'll have the opportunity to compete with some of the kindergarten students here. There's a marker here if you like as well. So, anybody else? Come on, there's got to be more. So, go for it. Take some. Got the hot pink ones. So,
pass them down.
You want to take
Anybody?
one and pass them down. And just 2 markers there if you want.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Just watch it. These are Sharpies. They'll bleed through on whatever you're writing on, probably.
Good. Take one pass.
Would you like one? No? Okay. You have a mark. All right.
Back of the room, people. Come.
Anybody else?
Anybody?
No? I make teachers do this all the time. The kids are always very eager to do it, but it's always very interesting, and teachers quite often draw very similar diagrams to students. So, you got one? You need a marker? Red's not going to work for you on the pink, probably. So, all right. Great. So just take a minute or two, sketch it out. We can actually collect them and maybe just stick them up on the wall if that makes it easy for you. You guys are good? So. Question?
Marker.
Marker? Okay. They're right there. All right. Who said that? Who needs it? Okay. Yeah, please draw whatever you like, and it doesn't have to be beautiful, but one of the what we're doing is evaluating the existing conditions right now. So again, we're looking for a variety of different feedback points into the evaluation. So, great, thank you for putting that up. So this is your competition. If anybody's done, I'd be glad to stick them on the wall here. The technology won't allow us to broadcast it. Maybe we can collect them afterwards, but if we put them up on sort of a gallery, everybody can take a look at some of the feedback as well. Awesome, thank you. Can you just write, sorry, one fact, what's the factor that you're evaluating on there too? Ready? All right, great, thank you. That's an interesting comment. Any others? Yeah. Thanks. You'll help my bottom line at the end of the year if I can collect the markers back. Okay. That's a good one. Thank you. All right. Interesting. We got some sort of new ones here. So daylighting, this one's about the screen being too bright. This one's about happy plants, but laser beams in your eyes. Yeah, so we haven't heard some of these comments before. Air availability, is that a positive or a negative? It looks kind of tense. Yeah, so any others? I'll come back that side. All right. Do you have what you need? So let me just quick survey of this side. So this one says the AC is working, but the door is kept open, keeps the room unbalanced. Daylight, so people are sleeping in the diagram. So artificial light, sleepiness, so there's a consistency on the lack of daylight. Acoustics and plants, both good, yay. Daylighting, so there's broad consensus here. Dark and sleepy, airflow and daylighting associated. My head is cold, the chair's comfy. The heat in the room makes me feel sleepy. So seems to be a little bit of certainly a consensus on the daylight and but also some of the air quality issues. Acoustics, is that a good one? People are smiling, right? So we'll take that as a good sign. No daylight, again, yeah, so again, reinforcing the idea that daylight's a key factor missing in this environment. So.
Especially at 8 a.m.
Yeah, you'll note I didn't bring the daylight meter for this one, so I figured that wasn't a good activity. So. All right. Awesome. Well, we will come back to the live data a little bit later, but now to go back to our actual study and get you the results of that. So overall, we had very, very positive results, but just looking at the differences between the modernized and non-modernized surveys, students were 25% more proud to go to school in a modernized building, and they were happier, calmer, and more ready to learn. So all those things we were hoping to find, we did find improved satisfaction in those modernized schools. In addition, looking at the IEQ specifically from a satisfaction standpoint, both students and faculty reported increased satisfaction across the board on each of those IEQ metrics. So the perceptions were significantly improved in the new facilities. Those numbers with the teachers we found to be extremely exciting. They have a bit more world context to compare to when they're comparing different buildings than a student who maybe has only gone to the school in this one building and only knows those facilities. So seeing between 30 and 45% increases in satisfaction was a really big deal for us. Then looking at the actual measurements on site of those IEQ factors. So these graphs at the very center is the worst measurement we got for any of the IEQ factors, and at the exterior of the graph is the very best measurement. So the perfect room would have the entire circle filled in. So looking at the average of non-modernized schools and modernized schools, you can see just by looking at it that the modernized schools are performing better in almost every category in those actual on-site measurements. So really great to see. But to look at those in a little bit more detail, daylight particularly, we saw 47% higher faculty satisfaction in modernized buildings, and that also correlated with our on-site measurements. We found about 10% more well-lit area within the new schools. This was a little bit interesting since all the schools we were looking at were modernizations of existing facilities. So you're a little bit limited in what you were doing. We weren't really adding windows to most of these facilities. We were working with what we had, but there was some shading added. There were light shelves added in some of the schools. So there was some difference in that. But overall, we found daylight to be one of the most influential factors, and it was most highly rated around satisfaction across the board for all of us. So something that we know daylight is important in schools, but it really is perceived by both the students and the staff in those facilities. Moving on to acoustics, we found that the ambient noise levels in modernized schools were 11% lower than they were in the non-modernized schools, and that also correlated to an improvement in satisfaction within those facilities. We did find acoustics to be interesting. While there were improvements in these modernized schools, across the board, all of the schools performed pretty poorly around acoustics, which we found to be particularly interesting because, as Patrick mentioned, in DC, all the public schools are required to get LEED Gold. So they're all meeting the acoustics minimum prerequisite, at least. If they also went for the credit, they were probably doing additional measures. But across the board, satisfaction and performance around acoustics was very low. So that's something that we've noted as architects we need to continue to work on and improve. And I know that Patrick and the district have noticed as well that it's something they want to start focusing on in their future modernizations.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I mean, I personally don't care what the ambient noise is. It really matters when kids and students, and staff are in the classrooms. And if we're not doing enough in an occupied setting, like Katie said, it just means we need to rethink and sort of evaluate what other measures can we do in these classrooms, because if no one's in the room, it doesn't really matter, honestly. So we need to think about what additional measures. We already do a ton in the ceilings, obviously, to meet the ambient noise, and so we need to sort of lean on the architecture world to sort of think a little outside the box and how do we improve the acoustics in an occupied setting, especially in a school where you get 25 loud 8-year-olds. It's a tough challenge, but it's really important for us.
So moving on to air quality as well, we found that the peak CO2 levels within the modernized facilities were 41% lower than they were in those non-modernized facilities. The measurements in our non-modernized facilities got very, very high around some of the CO2 levels. They were above 3,000 parts per million in a couple instances, so it was definitely a great improvement in those modernized schools especially. But again, we also saw that the faculty satisfaction significantly improved with those improved measurements. So great to see those metrics correlated as well. And then moving on to thermal comfort. Again, the not modernized schools were in the comfort zone only 42% of the time, while our modernized schools were in the comfort zone 84% of the time. And again, some of the measurements we got in those non-modernized schools were pretty startling. We got schools that were getting up to 85 degrees pretty regularly and down into the 50s in the same facility. So there were definitely some issues in those non-modernized schools and much better performance in the modernized schools. And also looking at the thermal images as well, we saw improvements in the modernized facilities, which was great to see, especially since they are renovation projects. So again, only some things you can do, but even improving the windows and making those small changes did have a difference in the thermal imaging as well. And then looking at our archival data, the modernized schools outperformed the non-modernized schools around student attendance, boundary rate, enrollment, student nurse visits, and faculty retention rates. So all of those great data points that Patrick needs to take to the mayor, we did find improvements in those modernized facilities compared to the non-modernized. But the part that I find the most interesting is when we started looking at the correlations between all of these different data points. So we did find between the on-site measurements, schools that had better thermal comfort, air quality, and daylight also found higher faculty satisfaction rates. So again, really making those connections between the things that we know inherently are important, but they really do correlate to that improved satisfaction. Also, schools that had better performance around thermal comfort had better student attendance, enrollment, and less nurse visits. So this is one of the things we were really trying to do in this study, was start to tie those IEQ factors directly to those student performance indicators, and we were really glad to see some of these connections occurring. And then also looking at daylight, schools that performed better around daylight had an improved boundary rate and higher enrollment rates, which was great to see, and also had less crime around the school, which was one that we found very interesting. I would hypothesize that that's related to daylighting also has better views to the outdoor, so maybe there are more eyes on the street in these facilities that have better daylight as well, so another side benefit of those strategies as well. But one of the things we really were hoping to find was a connection between schools that were modernized and those school performance indicators. And we found for a couple reasons we weren't able to do that with this study. Number one, we were only looking at 9 schools within the 110 in DC Public Schools portfolio, so we know our scope was a little bit limited to start to make those assumptions. But the other big thing was that some of these schools had just opened the year prior, so the students hadn't been in these facilities very long. It takes a little bit longer to start to see those metrics change. So we hope to go back in 5 or 10 years and be able to see if there's really a difference after these modernizations. So that's something we hope to follow up in a future study to look at a little bit more detailedly. So our high-level conclusions from this study: we found that there are significant improvements in modernized schools. It's definitely a worthwhile thing to do, so we were happy to support that hypothesis. Another big takeaway was that note around acoustics. It's something that we want to start looking at, trying to identify what the source of that issue was. Is it that the background noise is too high? Is it that when it's occupied, the noise is an issue? And start to see what we can do about those specific issues. And then around daylight, it was great to see high levels of satisfaction with that. So we want to continue to see how we can improve those factors as well. And then finally, we realized we needed more time around those school performance indicators. So that's something we want to follow up with additional studies in the future. So we're each going to take a little moment to talk about our next steps. It's different for each of us based on our roles. So we want to tell you what we hope to do in our next moves.
So I guess I'll start from the, owner-client side. First off, thanks to the team to doing all this, getting us all this data. I think, like I mentioned, the biggest takeaway I had from this, from the pure evaluation sample, was the acoustics thing, which we just chatted about. It's really hard to learn and have a conversation with your colleagues and your classmates if you can't hear them. So that's one thing that I really am pushing Sean and Katie and the rest of the architects in the room to help us think through. So that's an important thing. One of the things that it's easy to gloss over from our standpoint is the teacher satisfaction. We do a lot of great work. You guys design great buildings. Really, the most important people in the building are the teachers. They spend hours and hours and hours with the kids, and if they're not happy, that's gonna pass down to the kids. So that's one of the things I was really, really pleased to see through the study was the teacher satisfaction. So we want to, honestly, if I'm being honest, use this as a recruiting tool. We are essentially in a competition for DC is a very urban environment surrounded by a lot of school districts and a lot of places where teachers can work. If we can get the best possible teachers in our district, that's just better for the kids. So we can actually use this data to say, hey, if you come here, you're going to be in a better environment than going to Baltimore, going to Northern Virginia, or Montgomery County. There's just so much competition for teachers, and like I said, for us, it's really important that we get the best teachers. Even within DC, we're up against private schools, we're up against charter schools. So if we can use this data to help us get the best teachers, we're going to do that. The other thing that is really important for me, and what I want to dig into sort of with future studies, is, as I mentioned in the early onset when Sean mentioned the $88 billion that are spent, we spend more money on utility bills than we do for supplies for schools, which is, as a school district, that just doesn't feel right. So how do we make sure we lower that cost so that money can directly go back into the schools? And that's what's so great about a conference like this, is we get to think about those things. And now we need to sort of turn that data into sort of in the operational side. We are still dealing with building engineers that are used to working on boilers. So now how do we ramp up the training so that they can work on the VRF systems and don't change all the controls so it's running 24 hours a day? And we need to be able to actually point to data to show, hey, the things that we're doing operationally in these schools, they're designed this way, which means we should be saving this amount of money, which goes directly back into the schools. So one of the things that I want to take away is sort of build on this, and how do we turn this into sort of an operational expense evaluation so that I can talk to the chancellor, superintendent, the mayor, and say, hey, if you help us lower these utility costs from an operational standpoint, we can fund that early literacy initiative that you wanted to do that you couldn't fund. So that's a big thing for me, is sort of thinking through what are the things we need to evaluate. This is a good jumping off point, I think, to get people excited about the topic. But I think there's just more that we want to dig into. And then additionally, as I mentioned, I hate doing the same thing over and over again just because that's how we've done it. So the thing, like the acoustics thing really jumped out to me. We need to do more. So how do we dig into these projects and learn from them and improve? And then I think the other thing I just want to close is I recognize how lucky we are at DC to have this investment. If there's other ways we can partner with other jurisdictions, Chicago, Philly, New York, any school district that hasn't gone through this, we want to open our data up to folks and let them learn, and so they can get to the same spot we're at. So those are my takeaways.
So just to speak from my standpoint, as a school designer, certainly what I'm hoping for is that our projects continue to get better. So I think the perfect illustration out of the study here is this issue of acoustics. So even Patrick and I were trying to brainstorm yesterday. We have a project under construction right now. Can we actually make an intervention there that would amp up the acoustical performance, and then we can use that because we have the pre-occupancy data on that particular building as well. So we can see if we start to make a dent in that very, very significant issue in particular. And it was interesting, one of my colleagues says about the Heshon-Mahoney study, he quotes one of the researchers there saying, basically that you can have all the daylight in the world. If the acoustics don't work, then it all falls apart in a school, certainly. So we're trying to push that as hard as we can. But I think that the next piece for us here, and we're working on this very actively right now, is to try and get the next study together that builds on the base of sort of IEQ and the community factors that also have been part of these studies, but to also plant another kernel in that mix of educational adequacy, you might consider it. So again, getting to the more programmatic factors, how is the space working? How do people use the space? Is there sufficient space? Are the adjacencies right? All those kinds of issues, that ultimately make the performance of the school succeed or not in many ways, or hinder or foster that kind of environment that we're trying to select. So certainly, I think that's how we'll continue, as you can see, to continue to put pieces onto this idea that there's an action research opportunity for us in each of our projects, to make a dent in this kind of study. But I think, again, the value that is coming out of this study, I think, is already impressive, and then that it's being used. So that's beyond our wildest dreams in some ways when we cooked it up. And I think what we have the opportunity to do now is there are a lot of other districts, certainly, that can learn from what DC is doing. So we're also trying to make that portable, and the data coming off of that, so that a city that's approaching a modernization program inevitably is going to be underfunded. That seems to be the case all the time. So how do you make good decisions, as a school board member, to take perhaps a pot of money that's 2/3 of what you thought you needed, and make the best value investment, relative to that as well. So I think those are the next steps in, the research process that we're undertaking. So.
And from my role, it's a little bit different. So I work with our schools group, but I also work with all of our practice areas at Perkins Eastman, which ranges everything from small interior office fit-outs to large master planning projects. So I want to take this protocol that we've developed with our schools group and be able to apply that to different project types, which becomes an interesting challenge in some of those different project types because the metrics are very different and the measures of success are very different. So starting to identify what the right metric is for a large-scale mixed-use development and then what the measure of success is a really interesting question, and we can't necessarily measure it with my little CO2 monitor that sits in the corner at a scale like that. So I think it's a really interesting challenge that I want to start tackling with our different project types, and then also continuing to build within the schools group and the single building industry, figuring out what are the additional metrics and how can we start to get to the why for each of these things. So if there are issues with acoustic satisfaction, what's actually causing that, and how can we start to pinpoint the issues so that we can find the solutions to change those things. So that's my goal moving forward. So real fast to give us the results of our POE in this room. So we'll start with acoustics. So here's just some industry benchmarks of how loud it is at certain decibel levels to give you a range. So our average in this room was 57 decibels, so a pretty good number down there at the moderate to quiet zone. And the max we got to was 73. So good work, sound team. We didn't blow out anybody's ears in the room. We did a pretty good job here. And that correlates pretty well with those satisfaction numbers we saw in the survey. So good to see. Moving on to air quality. So looking here at the parts per million of CO2 concentration in the space. Here our average was 835 parts per million. So we're doing pretty good. We're starting to get into that complaints of odors and general drowsiness. But the max we got to today was 924. So if you were sleepy, it's just because you stayed out too long last night. It's not because of the room. You can't blame it. Sorry, guys. And then for temperature, so we got up to 74 degrees. So we were getting close to that max recommended temperature, but our average was around 73 degrees. So on the warm side, we started to see some dissatisfaction with that, but it does fall within the OSHA recommended workplace temperature range. So that's what we found today. So before we get to questions really fast, I do want to say that we published all of this research. It's available in a white paper that's on the Perkins Eastman website. It's also featured right now in School Planning and Management magazine, which we have a few copies of, and is also available in the publications area at the trade show. So if you pick that up, that has the direct link to download the paper as well, or you can just go to the Perkins Eastman website and get all of this data and read a little bit more about the study. But now we have plenty of time for questions, so if you guys want to line up behind the microphone, we can answer anybody's question.
Hi. Alejandra Menchaca from Thornton Thomas City. This was fascinating. Thank you so much. I have two questions, or maybe a comment and a question. You talked about getting to the why, and you have so much data that I'm curious, or maybe this is adding to your list of next steps. You have 9 schools where I'm sure you took different approaches in terms of designing, from an acoustic standpoint, from a daylighting standpoint. You mentioned glare. You said in some of the schools we put shading, but in some of the others we didn't. Peak CO2. I'm sure maybe not all of your schools had demand control, as or maybe they did. So it seems to me that it would be amazing, maybe for next year, to hear about what is it about what you did in the design that is changing this, because it's not just modernizing. You can modernize very poorly, right? And so I think that getting deeper into that message is going to give everyone else a very good sense of what is working and what isn't.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One point that perhaps we didn't make is that a couple of those buildings, we actually worked on, but others were done by other architects, and I think that actually was valuable, so that it wasn't sort of a bias towards one firm's design approach. It was several firms impacting those modernized schools. So again, they're all trying to perform to LEED Gold standards, but it's different decisions, as you note, from those different design entities, and from the school community that would have driven those decisions as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think it's drilling down even further is where I want to take it and figure out, like you said, the why. Mm-hmm. And honestly, from my standpoint too, we also need to do sort of a cost-benefit analysis of when we put these light shelves in, we put these shades on the exterior of the building. They're not cheap. Are they performing the way we need them to perform? Because if they're not, we need to think about other ways to do it. And I think what we're seeing is we're getting good results, but actually pinpointing it so we can actually say this investment was worth it from a fiscal standpoint. From an operational standpoint, I think you're right. If there's things that we're not seeing, like we keep bringing up acoustics because it's the obvious one, but we need to figure out what are additional, like why are we not getting that? Do we need more acoustic panels on the walls, or what is the next step to figure out how do we improve it?
Maybe as simple as the ones with better acoustics. Is it because they got the acoustics credit? right? Even if you're going for prescriptive, right?
Yeah.
Are those two correlating, or is it just that new construction is better?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would also say the interesting part of that is the existing buildings that we worked with ranged from, I'd say, the 1930s to the 1960s when they were originally built. So there was some difference in those existing structures of how easily they're renovated and how well they performed as well. So it's interesting to see that some of the older buildings actually end up performing better once they're modernized because they were set up for success around the passive measures to begin with.
And then my question, just very quick, you mentioned you had a metric, Katie, on healthier occupants, 19% or 70%, and I'm 17%, and I'm curious, how did you measure healthier, or was it a perception?
That was a perception question, so that was included in the survey of their perception of health.
But one of the things we do want to keep digging into as we get more data, we actually keep pretty good records of nurse visits and things like that, asthma rates. We don't have a ton of data on these new schools yet, but that's something we want to keep building and evaluate.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Todd. I work with schools in the state of Ohio. And a couple questions. Of the 110, how many are reno, how many are new? And then second question,
yeah, so I guess I can start there. These are rough numbers, but I mean, new, it's very small. I would say we probably have 5 brand new construction, 5 to 7.
Wow.
Most are renovations, and then I would say it's probably renovation and renovation with new construction addition. Like I mentioned, we have a lot of buildings that are historically significant, so we typically have to work within the existing fabric, and then if we can add on to it, we can and do, but most are renovations with additions.
Great. And then with the 28 you've done completed, how many were under 2009? And as you've moved to version 4, have your cost sets changed? And I guess that's the main question.
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but starting with Watkins, which opened 2 summers ago, was when version 4 started. So we've had 9 open under the new lead version 4. It's tough to pull out the cost of it. DC's got and this is something we need to look into, I think with help of others, but DC's got a very hyperactive construction market, and we see pretty insane pricing. It's hard to sort of parse out what the price drivers are, if it's the design to enhanced acoustics or any sort of lead-driven thing. We haven't done that level of analysis, but I think it's something that we want to do. But we have seen prices go up, but it's hard to say it's because of lead version 4.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I'd piggyback really quickly on that question. So there was a question about the rating system, versions of the rating system, and I also had a question that said, well, were all these the version of the rating system that was schools specifically, or was it also NC?
Everything we've done was schools. Yeah.
Everything was schools. All right, so that prerequisite is kind of curious.
Correct.
Then the next question I had was, during the RFP process, when you started all this in the modernization, did the RFP address a lot of these issues about trying to bring them up to certain standards for indoor air quality?
So we don't specifically outline indoor air quality, there's a LEED Gold mandate, which is law, so that's baked into the RFP and the contract that the design team needs to design to that and the construction company needs to build to that. We have not gotten to the level of specifying certain metrics within the different categories. There's a general sort of LEED version 4 requirement.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I will say we did mandate it. It's a requirement in a new project that's going to be net zero. But that's sort of the first time we've done that.
I think the intent of that study, though, is that now people they understand the impact of some of the decisions while they're working in a LEED system and where to place the emphasis. So that's true on our side of the table, but equally true of the project management team, from the client side as well. So we're hoping, perhaps not to mandate or be prescriptive about that, but they understand the impact of some of the decisions that are being made during the design process.
Hello, it's Mohammed Abbas with WSP. Thank you for a great presentation, especially the occupant survey was inspiring for everyone, I believe. I'm curious to know, you mentioned CO2 for air quality, but Definitely for when we modernize building, we're providing more fresh air, so we have lower CO2. But what about VOC? I mean, that's a parameter that even a lot of times after renovation and modernization, we see a higher threshold of that in our buildings, and that's also kids are really sensitive to the parameter like that. So have you measured that, or have you considered that, or kind of my second question, which is kind of related to that, is have you pursued low-emitting material credit in version 4, which has more difficult requirements for the schools and different categories?
Yes, so we tried to measure VOCs in this study, and we used a sensor that was a moderate price range, I would say, and it did not end up having the reliability that we would have hoped for. So we got data on a few schools, but not enough that we ended up including those results in the study itself. So we did see some slight differences, but we didn't go as far as statistically analyzing to see if there was connections in that. So we do hope to do that in the future. I know those sensors are progressing rapidly right now. So we're still continuing to try out some different options to see if there's a portable version of a VOC sensor that we can start using for this type of study. So that is something we hope to do in the future. And to get to the other part of your question, at least on the V4 projects we've done, we have not met that LEED low-emitting credit yet. Some of that is limited by the contractor side, and by the time we mention it, it's already something's in the building that has already lost it for us. So we haven't tackled that one yet, but I'm hoping more and more products will become readily available with those new standards, and that will get easier over time as well, because it is a very important issue.
Okay, so just one more quick question on that. Was it because of the problem with the GC and subs later in the game, or because that wasn't specified earlier to make sure that for paints and adhesives, those meet the requirement? What was because we also look at that, we always look at that from the sustainability consulting or engineering point of view. So I'm curious to know that how architects are approaching that.
Yeah, I would say we haven't gotten that far in prioritizing it for a project yet. Some of that has been driven by schedule on these projects. A lot of the DC public schools have been design build as well. So we are installing things as we are writing the specifications for them. So sometimes at that point it's gotten too late, but it is something that we want to start focusing on and seeing if we can get some standard things in our spec that do meet that.
And that point's actually really important. I mean, historically, we've accomplished so many of these buildings because we would do sort of a really fast design build process. So we've actually intentionally tried to slow it down and do more of a CM at risk model where we have a year to design and then 2 years to construct. That took a lot of political. It was a challenge because every elected official wants to get as many done as possible and put that up there. But we really see the benefit of slowing down so we can actually have these conversations and be thoughtful about it. So I think moving forward we'll be better positioned to do that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning. How are you?
Oh, thanks.
Good. My name is Ben. I'm a high school teacher in Missoula, Montana, so I'm coming from a different perspective of things. I had two questions. The first one was your presentation was great, but there weren't a lot of pictures of high school kids on there. So I'm curious if there was a difference between survey techniques and the process going through this from middle schools to high schools? And then secondly, from a teacher's point of view, are you measuring the academics as they go through as well as comfort levels and such?
I can answer the first one, and I'll just be completely honest about this one. So when we were kicking this study off, we had a graduation scandal at one of our high schools, and there was a lot of attention on high schools, and we didn't want to give them sort of fatigue about going through the survey process, the staffing. So we actually intentionally pulled high schools out because they just had so much going on at that time, and we didn't want to add another thing to their plate. But we do a lot of high school projects, and Sean and Katie have done a lot of great work for us. In terms of the academics, that's something we want to look at. It's one of those things that's really tough to, I really want to be able to sell the work that we do, but there's so many things that impact academics. It's their teachers, it's their principals. We have a high turnover rate with teachers and principals. DC is a very transient city, so it's really tough to pinpoint saying these things are really driving academics because there's, like, as you know as a teacher, there's so many things that go into it. So I don't ever want to be in a position where we're saying our work is doing this amazing thing where it's, increasing test scores by X%. Because I know unless we can correlate it somehow, but there's just so many other factors that go into that. So.
Sure. Yeah, I think from the high school standpoint, again, and we sort of started the prototype at Dunbar, which is a high school. And so the tools and, the qualitative survey, was built, sort of for a high school, in fact. But what we realized actually as we started to engage younger and younger children was that the survey is too long, it's too complicated, they don't understand some of the jargon. So ultimately we worked back towards that drawing exercise. So in many ways it was designed for that. But one of the things that we did find is that students, the access to the technology to do an online survey wasn't always there. So in many instances we had to do a hard copy and find a time in their schedule. And so there were complexities about that. So we ended up doing sort of the data entry for them off of a hard copy survey just to make it easier then and assure that we could get a higher return rate, in many ways.
Gotcha. And hopefully, I know that teacher retention is it's going to be a big problem across the whole United States. Are you guys going to be tracking teacher retention in newer buildings versus buildings that aren't necessarily modernized?
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely something that I was really happy to see the results, as I mentioned in the study here, but that's definitely something we track. It takes a while to build a culture at a school, and the teachers are a big part of that. And if we just have constant churn and turnover, it's tough to keep sort of the momentum going. And so it's important to us to have, the best teachers there, but if we can have some consistency throughout, it's just beneficial for everyone. So yeah, it's something we track. We have so much data at our hands that honestly we have only touched on maybe 1% of it, which is a good thing. There's just so much more work for us to do, and that's one of the things we want to look at.
Great. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Good morning.
Morning.
The three of you did a real nice job with the presentation, and I enjoyed learning more about your study. Had a couple questions. You touched upon the importance of air quality and temperature control. How are you influenced when selecting the design of the HVAC system? Because as you know, energy and utility is a significant portion of the school bill, and there's technologies out there that can dramatically reduce that cost. So I'm curious on how are you influenced when you make your selection, and then who's the ultimate decision maker when it comes to doing it?
I guess it all sort of falls to me, but I have a team that informs. But we rely on the design teams and their MEP consultants to make recommendations. For HVAC, we typically, over the past, 5-7 years, have strictly gone with VRF systems for the efficiency of it. It costs a little more, obviously, but it gives us more control to zone the buildings. It gives us, it's a little more energy efficient. So typically, we sort of our baseline is a VRF. We have got some geothermal. Dunbar is a good example of a geothermal. Most is air-based VRF. But we rely a lot on the MEPs teams to make recommendations to us. Ultimately, we decide, but it's one of the areas.
Yeah, I think it's a big issue, and the CO2 and cognition study came out of the Chan School of Public Health actually as we were doing the post-occupancy evaluation on MLK. So we hadn't designed to those criteria, and so it was an interesting study, and we've got some metrics demonstrating where the building's performing relative to that, which is a bit higher than what that study would suggest. So in subsequent work, we've been trying to push for achieving the goals that they had established in the studies. But it's always that conversation, exactly as you're indicating, higher ventilation rates, more energy, and what's that doing to then the energy side of the equation, and can we afford that? Operationally and otherwise. So it's very much a topic of conversation on every project that we're doing right now. But certainly I think our aspirations, again, are to get to those things that impact education. And so we feel very strongly about trying to achieve those goals.
And one of the things on the utility side, we're actually kicking off a retro-commissioning project to go back to schools that have recently opened to make sure that they're performing in the way that Sean and his consultants designed, because you can design it all you want, and it's going to look great in your energy modeling, but once the school takes over, if they're changing the controls or whatever the engineers are doing in the building, it impacts performance. And we're digging into a school right now where we're looking at the energy consumption, and for some reason the units are kicking on at 3 in the morning, and there's no one in the building at 3 in the morning. We don't need to start heating the building at 3, and we're paying a lot of money for that. So we need to go back and sort of make sure that it needs to be operational, but it can't go so far that it's sort of throwing off what was originally designed, because we want to make sure our buildings are energy efficient. Because I mentioned that's just money that literally goes out of our bank account that does not go to a school. It's paying a utility company, and it's important to us. So.
Yeah, and I think that's the lesson for the educational outcomes as well. So it's not energy over time and educational outcomes, I think, is, again, the continuation in the study that we're doing.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi there. My name's Sharon. I'm an architect from Phoenix, and you might realize that Phoenix is, I think, 49th in the country for schools, public schools. So we have a lot to learn, obviously. So kind of tagging along with, I think, Alejandra, the first woman, her question is, we're such a mix. We get people from California, we get people from the Midwest, and we also get a lot of people that are retiring, so they're like, why am I going to invest in, my kids are somewhere else. Why am I going to invest in my schools in Phoenix? So what were the most impactful solutions you did for a city and people that don't want to invest in their schools? What were those few small things that you think in the schools you worked on that really made a difference?
Can you restate the question, I guess? I'm not sure that I...
Well, it's just, a lot of our schools, the majority of our people end up sending their kids to public school, or private schools, and charter schools. So the public schools tend to fail. They go up really quick. Construction is huge in Phoenix, but it's not really well thought out. There are some good design firms in Phoenix, and we try to do what we can. But the budgets aren't there. What Patrick's got, his initiative, the fact that LEED Gold is a standard, that just doesn't exist where we're at. So I'm trying to figure out, more solution-wise, design-wise, what you guys did that when you don't have the money just to completely do this kind of survey, to invest the time in this, to create these schools, if you're just going to do small improvements, did you find that, with the acoustics or whatever?
Okay. Yeah. I think that's very much the intention of why we're doing this, so that the entire architectural community, and the client side, can have those takeaways to say, and we do a lot of charter school work, so where do you spend those very limited funds that you have? So I think clearly the takeaways were. For me, on the study, that daylight's really powerful to the occupants, in these buildings, right? They acknowledge that perceptually and otherwise, and then the research, certainly backs it up. So it has a tremendous impact there. But this is why this acoustics quandary has arisen for us, because frankly, the Dunbar and our other buildings, they hit the enhanced acoustics credits in the LEED system. So we were all very taken aback that in fact the users aren't entirely happy in those environments. We thought they were great. For me, those become the two factors. The ventilation rates and others are certainly important, and research is starting to show that. But I think, Katie can correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't get as high a feedback response on those factors from buildings that were a little bit different than each other within the inventory. So.
Yeah, I would say the way I always encourage project teams to talk about or think about it is to look at the priorities and what are the occupants going to touch every single day. Where can you make the most impact with your decisions? So we often think about it with material selection. The students, if they're literal, are going to be sitting on the carpet most of the day. So let's make sure we pick a healthy carpet, because that's going to be the most important thing in this room. The ceiling tile, they're never going to interact with. So let's prioritize there. And I think you can think about it the same way on a larger scale and with these IEQ factors. If it's just, let's get some daylight into these classrooms and make that our priority for this project, then you've at least set some sort of goal that will have a direct impact on the students. maybe you can't touch everything on every project, but trying to identify what's going to be that most impactful thing for that population, I think, would always be my advice.
And I would just add, I mean, outside of this study, I mean, just from a pure design standpoint, I think it's really important to make a connection to the community that the school is actually in. One of the things that I'm really proud about is when you go through DC, you got all 110 buildings. None of them look the same. They're all different. They all sort of tie back to the community. And I think if there's ways to design to sort of enhance or build on what the community you're working in, it'll get people excited about it. I wouldn't work where I work if we did these prototype cookie cutter schools. I mean, I think every building is unique, every program is unique, and you got to celebrate that. So if there's little things, even just aesthetically, when you walk into a lobby, if there's a one-off project to brighten the lobby, like how do you tie that back to the individual culture of that community? I think that'll sort of, honestly, the reason we get so much money, it started with Sean's neighborhood or Katie's neighborhood asking for it. And if you can get them excited about it, it sort of builds up to the fact of, hey, we need to do something. And I think inspiring them to do that is one way to do it, to show them what's possible.
Yeah, these buildings, by the way, when I came to the district in 2001, we actually participated in a sort of very quick survey to inform the capital plan around 2003 or so. And you would go into these buildings, and they were deplorable. They were literally falling apart. The bathrooms were destroyed. There were staircases, egress stairs, that weren't safe to go in. It was, sort of a tragic, a set of circumstances. So, the district, with this reinvestment program, that's light years, from where they started, from buildings, ceiling tiles were falling and hitting people. There was one math teacher told me, look, it snows in my classroom. And he wasn't kidding. The windows were all broken, and then when it snowed like today, it was coming in. The investment was absolutely necessary, but now I think we're getting to the point where we can iterate on that investment and make sure that we're still getting better and better as we go.
Hi, thank you so much for great session and presentation. Thank you, Sean and Katie, Perkins Eastman, for the great study involving public schools. I'm just here to invite everyone in this session to our session. EPA has a Healthy Schools Research Project session at 3 p.m. in the booth 163. It's going to be an interactive educational session. We have 3 of our 7 EPA STAR Healthy School grantees, researchers presenting scientific results, how the school's built environmental conditions link to public health outcomes for K-12 school children. But the idea of having educational interactive session is to involve all of us, all of you, to think about how your professions could be directly linked to improving public health in school children. You don't have to be scientific researchers or even green building, whatever, advocates or activists, but each one of you does have capability to contribute greatly in improving public health issues involving K-12 children. So please do come to our session. And thank you so much again.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Lily Wong from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I'm just going to follow up on Intake Han's comment. He's our program manager at the EPA, and I'm one of the 7 grantees that received funding under that EPA announcement to do research on healthy schools. I'm so excited to see what you all are doing, and I will tell you that my expertise is acoustics. So I actually really liked what you were talking about today, because I believe that acoustics is also an issue that we don't fully understand yet, and I completely concur with you all that the occupied conditions are more important than the unoccupied. But of course, course, the current ANSI standard for classroom acoustics is only talking about unoccupied, and hence the LEED requirements are also basing it on occupied. But our study, we went into 220 classrooms, and we logged the sound levels, similar to what you're doing, every 10 seconds over 6 full school days. And we did find that when we did the statistical analysis that the occupied levels, we have student achievement data as well, so we're correlating to actual student outcomes. And we did find that the higher the occupied speech levels are in a classroom, the lower the students did on math achievement. And then we also found that reverberation is another aspect, which you just lump in acoustics, but I will talk more detailed later at our session at 3. The reverberation can also add to the noise level if it's too reverberant and the sound lingers too much. But what's interesting is the classrooms we studied, all of them mostly met the reverberation requirement of being less than 0.6. And then within that range, if it was higher, like towards 0.6, we actually do find that they have improved achievement in reading. So we don't want the reverberation to be too low, but really maybe on the towards the 0.5, 0.6. So very excited, though, to hear that you also found similar things about that, and I want to be able to connect with you afterwards so we can share more data.
Yeah, definitely. That'd be great.
That's great. Yeah, I think that one of the things we've been kicking around is the ANSI criteria. So it's time for modernization, I think, on the criteria, because clearly it's not achieving, what we had hoped it would, within our project. So, but the EPA studies that are underway, we are aware of them. I sat in sort of a midpoint review up in Philadelphia of them a couple months back. So we were working at the same time. So we're certainly glad to continue the conversation and share information with all those studies as well.
Yeah, and Sean mentioned it a little bit, and I guess I'll elaborate. We were kicking around an idea yesterday of a project that they're designing is sort of just starting construction about, figuring out maybe one room and do a blind sort of study about if we enhance the acoustics somehow, we haven't figured out what that means, in that room and compare that to the same second grade cohort. What are the differences between them, and is it cost effective to do it? Are we seeing the actual benefit of? I don't even know what the different treatments that we could do, but is there a way we can sort of isolate it and do something, and then measure it against the same population in the same school that doesn't have the same treatments in it?
Yeah, with the intention again of action research, we're not academics, but we can actually engage something very meaningful and physically. But if you could share your reverberation research with us, that would actually influence this very intervention that we're hoping to do. So.
Great. Thanks everybody for coming. I think we're.
Thanks.
Thank you.